This is the Connect podcast, where business meets leadership. We talk with influential newsmakers, business leaders, and decision makers important to New York's economy.
Welcome to another edition of the Connect podcast. I'm going to call it an emergency Connect podcast based on a recent memo that was floated around Albany yesterday from NYSERDA. And here to talk to us about that is Ken Pokalsky, who is our resident energy and environmental guy. And I don't know if you're okay with me calling you that, but I'm going to go ahead and call you that.
Call me that. Just don't call me Kenneth.
Got it. All right, Ken. So let's start with what happened this week. The CLCPA has been at the forefront of the last really couple of months. There's been rumors swirling around that the governor may try to slow things down in terms of implementation process. The goals initially sought out 7 years ago when the law was passed may not be as achievable as some think. Certainly there was no price tag up until this week. We'll get to that. Blake Washington, the governor's budget director, was at a forum who kind of, I would say, set out a test balloon, right? And said, this may not be as achievable as affordable as we once thought. And then the next day, NYSERDA, who's under the agency underneath the governor, released a memo giving out more specifics to what the budget director said the day prior. And it's actually the first time we've seen any kind of price tag with the CLCPA. So there's a lot to talk about here.
Sure, and some quick background. So Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, the CLCPA, we're going to be using that acronym a lot, did a number of things, but two of the central requirements were a 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 from a 1990 baseline, and 70% renewable energy generation also by 2030. Another feature of the CLCPA is to measure all this, it applies an accounting mechanism for greenhouse gas emissions that's used by virtually no other jurisdiction in the world. The UN doesn't use it. The United States government doesn't use it. No other state uses it. But what it does is it sort of amplifies, and by design, by the people who passed the law, amplifies what's considered to be the adverse impact of natural gas. So it supported the CLCP advocates' efforts to push New York State out of natural gas into electrification of a lot of things. So we've been moving on the path of implementation for a couple of years now, as you know, and there's some major components, including electric vehicles, electric buildings, significant offshore wind, all of which have hit either logistical or legal headwinds, no pun intended. So we're not making near as much progress in terms of achieving renewables and electrifying transportation and buildings as we envisioned. And the state has admitted that in the state energy plan, which was just updated, we're projecting achievement of the renewable energy goals sometime in the middle to the end of the next decade. The state has said we're definitely not going to achieve the 2030 emission reduction target. And so the question, we're asking today is, what happens next?
So let me stop you there. And I saw some kind of arguments over the last 24 hours on this. Are the reason why we're not going to achieve the targets because they were not achievable in 2019 when they were passed, or so much has happened since 2019? The fact that supply chain has been disrupted because of a major pandemic. The fact that we had a major pandemic. The fact that there was a war in Ukraine. Is all that playing into effect?
Oh, those things didn't help, no doubt. I think there's a lot of skepticism from day one as to the achievability of those two targets. In the law put in place the scoping planning process, on which there were, out of about 20 participants, there were 3 people from the energy world, and all 3 of those voted against the final plan because they didn't think it was achievable or affordable. So there's always been concern about the achievability of the numbers. There's always also been significant concern about what this is going to cost and the lack of any real cost impact assessments from day one. And that's part of what all those things together sort of brought us to the piece that NYSERDA put out yesterday, which we can talk about.
Yeah, so they put out this memo and they addressed it to the governor because NYSERDA is of course, an authority, an agency underneath underneath the governor. So the memo basically said, this is again the first time that we've seen costs, essentially $4,000 per upstate resident. And I don't know if that's a household or resident. I do want to clarify that, but $4,000 for oil or natural gas under the CLCPA implementation. And then for New York City specifically, about $2,300. And is it per customer?
Per household is the way
Per
they
household,
and
per
here's what
year increase.
and here's what they did. So these other programs, the offshore wind, which has run into a lot of issues, the electric vehicle mandate, which has been, we think the authority for it has been overturned by the U.S. Senate. None of these major initiatives that were intended to produce emission reductions are not moving near as fast as anyone thought they were going to. So one of the other parts of this implementation plan was a thing called cap and invest. And what that is, major emitters of greenhouse gases would have to buy from the state an allowance. One allowance equals the legal authority to emit 1 ton of emissions. So it was always expected that this cap and invest or cap and trade program would be part of the overall implementation plan. It was never going to be the driver. From our point of view, it was never going to be the thing that produces emission reductions, but it's going to be a way to measure progress and also, no small part of it, generate funds for the state that would be spent on climate change related payments. So what NYSERDA put out yesterday said basically this, and part of the backstory here is this cap and trade, cap and invest rule has not been issued. It was expected to come out in January 2025. In her January 2025 State of the State message, Governor Hochul said we're delaying the rulemaking, but we're doing other things, including putting $1 billion climate fund into the budget. Since then, a handful of environmental groups sued the state, arguing issuance of rules to achieve the 40% emission reductions was a non-discretionary mandate of the legislature. You had to do it. They won in state Supreme Court. That decision is being appealed by the state. So the fate and the timing of the cap and trade program is somewhat in limbo. What NYSERDA put out yesterday basically said this: if we are forced to put out the cap and trade rule and put it out in a way that basically using just that mechanism, we're going to hit our emission reduction targets. We're going to have to set those per ton emission charges so high, we're going to see these significant adverse impacts on households and business. And they talked about where the draft plan that was being discussed in January 2025 was talking about per ton emission charges in the $15 to $20 a ton range. The report that came out yesterday talked about per ton allowance prices in the $120 to $170 per ton range, almost tenfold. And what they said is that, in part, those assessments are a tax on carbon. So the natural gas used by homes, the natural gas used by power plants that generate electric power, the gasoline you put in your cars, all of those are going to be subject to carbon tax under the cap and trade program. And if you look at what that, we know what the emission factors are. Some easy math says, here's what this is going to cost per gallon of gas at $170 a ton. Here's what's going to cost for 1,000 cubic foot of natural gas. That's a simple math equation to calculate, given the average consumption of business and households, what this is going to cost. That's what they said. It's not a full accounting of the cost of the transition under CLCPA, but it's a projection of what a really onerous cap and trade program would cost. And importantly, what was really understated in their report is at even $120 a ton, the impact on power plants, on large industrial sources, even on some large residential and university facilities is massive. We see, annual impacts of over $10 million per facility for some of these. There's one facility in the state would have a 9-figure uh, emissions tax. We see, more than, multi-million-dollar impacts on some university and residential settings. It impacts power plants. It impacts waste management facilities. So basically, almost everything that residents of New York State touch will see their costs go up significantly under that plan. And that, the conclusion was, if we are forced by the courts to do a cap and trade program that's designed to hit that 2030 target, it is going to be unaffordable. And what they downplay is it would be economically devastating.
But what you just laid out was a lot of in the weeds stuff that somebody like you who, lived and breathed this stuff for the past 7 years understands. The average consumer, did they even understand what CLCPA was or that there was a climate law at all?
Here's my take on it. I think this was always the narrative was climate change is all about big power plants and big industry. And that's who we have to go after to reduce emissions. Well, in New York State, the largest emitting categories are buildings and vehicles. Industrial direct emissions from industrial facilities is about 2% of total carbon emissions in the state. Total emissions from all power plants in the state is about 15%. Where carbon emissions come from is our buildings, our homes, our stores, places we work, places we shop, and vehicles. Our personal vehicles are a large contributor, mass transit, airplanes, all of the above. So you're never going to reduce carbon emissions without impacting all of us in our day-to-day lives. And in part, this report illustrates that. If you want to put a tax on carbon, which in effect what a cap and trade program is, it's going to be a tax on the gas you put in your car, the natural gas and heating oil you use to heat your homes, and all the other things, the energy that goes to support your place of work, your stores, all the food that gets transported to New York State, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's been, the narrative has really downplayed how broad-based impact implementation of CLCPA is going to be. But now we're seeing, I think the first time that the Hochul administration has said so bluntly that this is going to impact everyone.
How important do you think it was the fact that this wasn't a Governor Hochul initiative? This was signed into law. I mean, certainly a legislature initiative, clearly, but Governor Cuomo obviously was on board with it in 2019. Then Governor Cuomo signed it into law. How much of the fact that she inherited this law played into the fact that she was willing to maybe slow down?
I'm not sure that had much to do with it. It was actually originally proposed by Governor Cuomo and then modified and adopted by the legislature. I think the concern has been building for a couple of years, and it really is looking at, our energy demands are growing anyway. I mean, look around everyone's house. We have more things that consume electric power all the time. We are limiting the ability to generate electric power by fossil fuel. We, I think, foolishly closed the Indian Point nuclear plant, which was a large share of electric power generation for the city. So we're pinching ourselves in terms of, the availability of electric power, yet we're using more and more of it all the time. And groups like the New York Independent System Operator, the independent group that sort of manages the state's electric grid and plans for what we need going forward, has been saying this for years. At some point, the ability of the grid and all the power generation connected to the grid cannot keep up with the demand all of us are imposing on the grid. And that is bad news. That's a reliability issue. It's also a cost issue. But you see disruptions in service. It's almost an inevitable outcome of the way these two lines are diverging. So this concern has been building. As you say, the energy geeks have been aware of this and following it for a number of years now. But it's getting to the point where something has to be done. And, the legislature amends laws every day. That's what they do. They come to Albany and amend laws. And to think that this is the one law that's sacrosanct, that can't be reconsidered and can't be modified based on some really significant evidence that its mandates are not achievable or affordable. I don't see why that's such a foreign thought for lawmakers or for some of the advocates. Amending the law doesn't mean New York State's abandoning its green energy and energy efficiency and climate efforts. It's modifying the plan, modifying the dates. But New York has been and will be one of the cleanest energy states in the nation, one of the lowest carbon economies in the nation. We're going to stay there, and we're continue to make progress. But force feeding an energy system into arbitrary rates and dates in a piece of legislation is going to have real consequences. I think we need to consider them now.
A couple of things you touched on there, I want to expand on a little bit. One, the advocates, their argument has always been, well, if this was implemented, the costs would go down. So they see the $4,000 figure was the big headline yesterday. Right away you see some assemblymen and senators who support this law say, well, if they had been implemented, these costs would have went down because we would have been having clean energy, and it would have replaced some of these costs that we have for natural gas. Is that accurate?
Not really. I mean, the one thing that we do have to recognize, if cap and trade was implemented, the state's already adopted a law that when the money starts coming in, a share of it will go to rebates to low and moderate income families to sort of offset the impact. Now, it won't be 100% offset, and you see stories about what percentage of households are living paycheck to paycheck. Having a significant hit on the family or household budget, only to be say, don't worry, we'll reimburse you either at the end of the year or the quarter, whatever the plan is going to be, is still going to be a real hardship on households, even if they're partially made whole after the fact. But so that's something to think about, but it doesn't obviate the impacts. It doesn't solve the problem. But we have been we built a lot of solar. Solar isn't particularly efficient. It's only about it only produces about 14% of its capacity because, well, it's night half the time and it's cloudy and solar panels get covered with snow. So we're building a lot of solar. I mean, that's the one bright spot. We've beat our CLCPA solar build. So I think it's disingenuous to say, oh, we should have been implementing this, because we have been. We're trying our hardest to move forward with offshore wind, despite a very hostile administration in Washington. But factors beyond the state's control, including supply chain impacts, have made those projects slower and more expensive. So I think we've been doing what we can. I don't know. You can't just snap your fingers and all of a sudden you have these large facilities that need interconnects. You need new substations. You need new power lines to move the power around. It's all big, complex, time-consuming, and expensive projects. So we're moving forward, but a lot of factors have slowed down that progress. So I think it's a little just disingenuous to say, oh, gee, we should have just tried harder.
2 points I want to end on. One, where this stands now and what the next step is, whose court the ball is in. And two, the fact that we at the Business Council, although have been advocating for a slowdown, are not advocating for the fact that we want to stop it altogether. So let's start with the NYSERDA memo. Clearly it's the Hochul administration's agency authority that put this out there. So but it's not Governor Hochul who's going to stop this. Can you explain the process now?
Well, there's a couple things that could happen next. The governor can propose legislative changes and put them on the table. Most likely,
the legislature has to do.
What the legislature would have to pass, yes.
Right.
And the thought is that would happen during the budget negotiations that take place between now and April 1st. I mean, there's certainly changes to implementation programs that are done through rulemaking that the administration can do unilaterally, but they can't change the statutory mandate to achieve 40% emission reductions by 2030. Someday the court may come out and tell them they have to do something, but I think they definitely need a legislative fix. So I think it's up to the Hochul administration to put something formal on the table. The other thing that's happening, Pat, is while the emission reduction mandates of the CLCPA don't provide a an off ramp. The renewable energy components do. It authorizes based on certain circumstances, including reliability concerns. It allows the Public Service Commission to modify its renewable energy mandate and timetable. Business Council, with about 30 other groups, have formally petitioned the Public Service Commission to do that, to hold a hearing and move forward with a modification of the renewable energy requirements. That is out for public comment now. It's posted on the Public Service website. Comments are due by the end of March. So that can happen. That's already part of the CLCPA. So that can happen without additional legislative action.
So, and then the final point I want to make is, so we released a statement when this came out. Now, again, I want to just give a little bit of background. Since 2019, we initially had questions about it. So right away, there were questions about it. Again, affordability, infrastructure, a lot of questions, but certainly affordability, one of them. Yesterday, in part of our statement said that, again, we are encouraging the legislature to agree to amendments to the CLCPA, but something I want to hammer home here. New York has been and will continue to be one of the most energy and carbon efficient states in the U.S. And the Business Council is not condoning abandoning the state's commitment to act on climate change, but we just believe that at this point in time, there needs to be evidence-based changes that protect reliability and affordability while we continue to make climate progress. So essentially, again, want to hammer home, we're not calling for a stop, we're just calling for a take a breath, and let's figure out what is achievable and how we can help affordability taxpayers in this state who are facing mounting affordability challenges, particularly really dating back to the pandemic, but certainly over the last 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, the CLCPA is not going to be repealed. We think a couple things need modification. We think the state should go to what's known as the 100-year global warming potential accounting method that everyone else in the world uses. I mean, that alone makes the math on compliant somewhat more manageable. We think the emission reduction mandate by 2030 needs to be amended. We know, as an example, Pat, to achieve that where we are today in 2026, we would have to eliminate basically all emissions from every building in New York State in 4 years. That's the volume. It's about 100 million tons a year of emission reductions we need to achieve. That just is a real world illustration of how unachievable it is.
Basically, every building in New York State would have to be redone to not have natural gas delivered to it.
You'd have to eliminate all greenhouse gas emissions from every building in New York State. And even that leaves you a little shy of what we would need to reduce to hit the statutory target. So if we know it's not achievable, let's talk about what is and what else we can do to pave the way to get the renewable energy investments and energy. We don't do near enough. For example, one of the most efficient things to do is to invest in energy efficiency. We don't do enough of that. So I think there's things we could do more of to move us down this path towards a cleaner energy system. I think that all could be part of a discussion of how we do, I think, sensible, necessary modifications to CLCPA.
Wonderful. Certainly not a topic that's going away. As you mentioned, we're about 30 days or so from when the budget's due, April 1st. So over the next 30 days, certainly this is going to be a hot topic. As you mentioned, likely to be negotiated between the governor and the legislature and included in the budget. And maybe just end on, if it's not included in the budget, what would that mean if it does go past? Does it mean a late budget, or does that mean we try it after the budget? I know it's $1 million question, but...
I mean, if it's not in the budget, I don't, as you said, the issue is not going to go away. Again, we don't know exactly what the governor's going to put on the table. It seems to make sense to do it in the budget when there's a lot on the table, including some $260 billion worth of spending.
Yeah.
As a post-budget issue, it's going to make for an interesting last 2 months of session.
All right. And we'll be here to talk about it.
Indeed.
All right. Ken Pokalsky, thanks so much.
You're very welcome.
This has been a presentation of the Connect podcast, produced by the Business Council, the voice of employers in New York State.